decade. Pride Fighting Championships played host to some of the biggest stars in MMA history, but there's been several fighters whose tenure in Japan is consigned to the history books. Today, we look at some of the biggest names with forgotten tenures in the Far East, from future UFC legends to stars of a very different field. Welcome to the INC, and these are 5 famous fighters you never knew fought in Pride. The late 2000s was a dark time for Robbie Lawler, but a one-off venture to Pride gave the future welterweight champion one of his brighter moments. Once considered the Mike Tyson of MMA, Lawler's career had hit a crossroads. 3 losses in his last 4 fights led to him being released by the UFC in 2004, while an attempted revival with Hawaii's Icon Sport ended at the hands of Jason Mayhem Miller. In 2006, Pride Fighting Championships announced their first ever event in the US and looked for named American talent to fill out its undercard. This led Lawler to don the fabled blue gloves that October, as he took on the King of the Cage champion Joey Villaseñor at Pride 32. On the biggest stage since his UFC release, Lawler knew an emphatic performance could put him in the window for the sport's biggest promotions, and the Ruthless One delivered on his promise 20 seconds into the bout. Lawler's win gave fans a reminder of the hype prospect of 5 years earlier, and it didn't take long for companies around the world to court the Ruthless One's services. Pride, however, wouldn't be one of them. Lawler not being invited for the company's second American show before Pride closed its doors a few months later. Lawler, however, would find refuge in Elite XC and later Strikeforce, but despite showing flashes of brilliance, he was often overwhelmed by the company's top middleweights. It wasn't until a move to welterweight and a UFC return that the fighter finally realized his potential. Mike Pol Klopek was a pro wrestling veteran for over 15 years, most notably in the WWE as former tag team champion Bart Gun. In 1998, Gunn won the infamous Brawl for All, pitting 16 mid-card performers against one another in legitimate shoot fights, only to leave the promotion after a brutal loss to Butterbean at WrestleMania. The defeat, however, didn't stop Gunn pursuing a career in combat sports, and while working in Japan as Mike Barton, took on Ikuhisa Minowa at Pride Bushido 13. Appropriately given Gunn's background, the fight took place primarily on the mat. Both men enjoying moments of top control, but Gunn seemingly unable to handle the scrambling ability of Minowa, despite the former pro wrestler having a significant weight advantage. Gunn was able to land power shots whenever the fight stayed on the feet, but the Japanese fighter's activity was enough to sway the judges, going on to claim a unanimous decision and further cementing his rep as Japanese MMA's giant killer. Gunn did find respite with a win over UFC veteran Cabbage Carrera and was even briefly linked to a rematch with Butterbean under MMA rules, only for plans to fall through, with Gunn calling time on his career shortly after. Butterbean, however, did fight pro wrestling competitions in Pride, as former WCW star Sean O'Haire faced the 400-pounder in his MMA debut, being finished in 29 seconds in one of the most embarrassing performances in company history. Hey, I'm not telling you something you don't already know. From one Brawl for All survivor, we turn our attention to another. At the height of the UFC Dark Age, Dan Severn had been one of its few bright points, winning the Ultimate Tournament in 1995 before claiming the company's Super Fight title over Ken Shamrock. But with the UFC ailing following the John McCain media blackout, Severn chose to distance himself from the promotion and turn his attention overseas. After a 7-fight unbeaten streak, Severn accepted a big money deal to compete in Pride's first ever card, where he took on fellow UFC star and inductee to this list, Kimo Leopoldo. Despite a 20-year career and over 100 fights, Severn's foray to Japan is largely ignored by the history books, and after rewatching the bout for this video, it's easy to see why.
As much as the purists want to believe it's all about technique, this is entertainment. And if it's not entertaining, you will be out of a job soon.
Severn and Kimo spent the majority of the fight circling one another while landing sporadic pot shots, agitating the capacity crowd in scenes reminiscent of his infamous match with Shamrock. Severn later claimed his passive performance was due to wanting to avoid a major injury, having accepted a UFC title match with Maurice Smith days before the Pride deal. Severn managed to score a takedown during the fight's final stages, and despite desperate attempts at ground and pound, fell short of a finish. With Pride not having judges for the show, the fight was declared a draw, despite Severn controlling the majority of exchanges. The fight's biggest impact, however, came in the US, as leg kicks sustained by Severn in the chemo bout forced him out of his planned UFC bout with Smith, creating friction between the fighter and the promotion that wouldn't be resolved for 2 years. Severn would fight just once more in the UFC, stepping in as a short-notice replacement to face Pedro Rizzo at UFC 27, Severn being finished, ironically enough, by leg kicks. Final Conflict 2005 is considered one of Pride's greatest ever cards, and an iconic name from MMA's past was brought from the wilderness to fill out its undercard. After being one of the biggest stars of the UFC's early years, Tank Abbott returned to MMA after a failed run in pro wrestling, but quickly realized how much the sport had evolved in his absence, suffering stoppage losses in his first 3 fights before being released by the UFC in 2003. Abbott ended his losing streak against Cabbage Correa in a rematch of their UFC bout in Hawaii, and this was enough to attract the attention of Pride, who booked Abbott against Hidehiko Yoshida for their landmark show that August. Abbott was always known as a fighter who used brawn over brain, and proved so again by scoring an early takedown and straight into the guard of an Olympic gold medalist. After being spooked by Yoshida's submission attempts, Abbott was frozen into a stand-up by the referee, and after failing in his second bid to get the fight to the mat, was finished in inevitable fashion.
This is where the gi comes in handy, and there we go, there's the choke!
The fight came to symbolize Abbott's later career, often used as a big-name jobber to raise the profile of rising heavyweight prospects. Abbott would suffer further losses in Strikeforce, Cage Rage, and most notably Elite XC, where he became the first high-profile victim of Kimbo Slice. Abbott called time on his career in 2013, having won just twice since his return a decade earlier. Rico Rodriguez was one of the UFC's biggest stars of the early 2000s, but the former champion's early days were plied halfway across the globe. After making his pro debut 12 months earlier, Rodriguez was invited to compete for Pride in 2000, taking on UFC veteran Gary Goodridge at Pride 9. After failing his early takedowns, Rodriguez got the fight to the mat midway through the first, using a mix of ground and pound and top control to neutralize Goodridge on the mat. Rodriguez went on to claim a unanimous decision, his passing of the Goodridge gatekeeper test confirming his place as one of the world's top heavyweights. Rodriguez claimed 2 further wins in Japan, beating John Marsh at Pride 12 and submitting former pro wrestler Giant Ochai, Rodriguez being one of the few men to win a fight via body smother, although nowhere near as impressively as Emmanuel Yarbrough a few years earlier. Rodriguez returned to Pride 3 years later, when he took on company legend Minotauro Nogueira at Pride Total Elimination. The UFC had sent several of its top stars to compete in Pride over the past 12 months, and after Chuck Liddell beat Alistair Overeem earlier that night, a win for Rico over the former Pride champion would strike a huge blow in their civil war with the promotion. Rodriguez dominated the fight, landing multiple takedowns while avoiding all of Nogueira's submission attempts. Despite controlling the majority of the match on the ground, the ringside judges gave the fight to Nogueira, a result so heinous it led to Dana White refusing to cross-promote with rival promotions. That fight would be the last notable one for Rodriguez, leaving the UFC by mutual consent before a journeyman run on the regional scene, where his career was marred by a significant weight gain and a battle with substance abuse. Rodriguez last fought in 2019, his career standing at 54 wins, 27 losses, and 1 no contest. And now, time for a few honorable mentions. Before becoming one of WWE's biggest flops, Nathan Jones failed in MMA when he was submitted during Pride's first show in 1997.
Oh no, go for a key lock. Oh, he got him on a key lock.
Josh Thompson's win over Daisuke Sugie saw him earn a Strikeforce contract and later the company's lightweight title. Do you remember Alberto Del Rio fighting in Pride? Don't worry, he doesn't either. This is the INC. Please like, share, subscribe, post your feedback in the comments, and ring the bell so you never miss a video.